You're not taking no shit, not taking no shit. None of that. Just forget me.
You don't even know my story. You don't even know your story, oh yeah. Oh yeah, you know, on the beat, I be a local. So moral. You post a new car on Facebook, but that's so la la. You work the bottom, loving your aggy jet, I say you photo. My advice for you, in my way, I got to confess. Confession, you gotta confess. You must have the impression. Enjoyment, got your blessing. Enjoyment, no more stressing. Enjoyment, got your blessing. Enjoyment, no more stressing.
It's never gonna be another man trash, it's another man treasure. Another man fool, it's another man poison. Got your good, according to your measurement. Got your good, according to your measurement. The player ain't chemist, and they play booty. Just because of impression, impression, fake impression, impression, yeah. You don't even know my story, or you want to share my glory, oh yeah. Everywhere you my way, oh way, oh, everywhere oh you my way, oh way, oh, even touch you my way, oh way, oh.
Enjoyment, got your blessing. Enjoyment, no more stressing. Enjoyment, got your blessing. Enjoyment, no more stressing. Yeah, they have more.
Hello and welcome to Focus on Liberia. This is Roundtable Africa, and I am Sekou Keller, your host. I'm very happy to bring you this edition of our broadcast. Our topic for today is the classical language of the African people. And we have today in studio our guest, Brother Asar Imhotep. Brother, welcome.
Peace and blessings. Thank you for having me on, and I look forward to our discussion today.
Before we begin, I would like to introduce our guest, Brother Asar Imhotep, for those of you who have just seen him for the first time. For me, I've known him for quite a while, so I would like to introduce him for our guests to know who this man is. Brother Asar Imhotep, okay, sorry. Sorry. Little problem here again. Okay. Our guest, Dr. Asar Imhotep, is a computer software programmer, a cultural theorist, an African researcher originally from Houston, Texas. Oh, by the way, he warned me and said, he advised me actually that he's not yet a doctor. He will be soon. So we prefer to be called Brother Asar Imhotep. His research focuses on linguistics, cultural and philosophical link between ancient Egyptian civilization and modern Bantu culture in South and Central Africa. He is the founder of Medu Ndela Institute for Culture and Scientific Advancement. Brother Asar Imhotep has authored several books, one of the latest being Where is Love? How Language Can Reorient Us Back to Love Purpose. Brother Imhotep, welcome to Focus on Liberia.
Oops,
Thank
sorry, I
you,
was
Amir.
muted.
Yeah.
Thank you again for having me on the program. It is truly an honor.
Thank you very much. Brother Asar Imhotep, very quickly before we begin, the first question here for you is what is African classical language? Because many a times most of us went to Western school that we inherited from the colonial system. When you mention the word classical, all we think about is Greek and Rome. That's the only thing we know in Africa. The word classic, once it comes in the classroom, we are talking about Greeks and Rome. So to say Africa and classic, that's sometimes it sounds strange in the ears of so many people. So please tell us, what is African classical language?
All righty. Well, you can answer this in two ways. We can talk about this from a purely linguistic perspective, and that is the proto-language of the languages that we know today. So the mother tongue of many of the groups of different languages. So you could speak about classical in that sense, or you could talk about classical in the sense of the premier civilizations and the language, the governing language that the speakers spoke. So whether you're talking about, the language of the Songhai Empire, the language of the ancient Mali Empire, or the language of the ancient Egyptian or Meroitic empires or whatnot, or the Luba Kingdom, and those are classical languages. At the time in a period when Africa was developing different types of civilizations and different models, and and just in a more historical set. So we're going through a second wave. Actually, we don't know what number this wave is technically, since all life comes out of Africa, and we've had civilizations in many different contexts over the years. But in terms of written history, within the last 5,000 or 6,000 years, we're going through another wave of development. And so the question will be, what will be the classical language 4,000 years from now for this period in our development?
Thank you very much, Brother Asar. The second question is, why do we need to study the source? Because there are people who are saying, look, we've come a long way and we now have French, we have English in Africa, we speak Portuguese now. And then you and I, we consider ourselves African. And then we are speaking English right now. Some people say, look, English is like a very beautiful language, and we have French, we have Portuguese. Why do we need to study the source? Why do we need to go back and study the source of our ancient African languages and classical languages? Why is it important?
Well, it's important for several reasons. The first is, when you study language, you're actually studying the psychology of a people. You're studying the values of a people. And the reason why going back to the classical languages are very important, especially for Africans, is because of the relatively recent colonial history of Africa and the displacement that these colonial powers have done on the continent, and in turn the diaspora, causing upheavals in the diaspora. So we have all these different cataclysmic events that have happened, that in some instances certain groups have forgotten their native languages, or in certain areas in modern times where they may speak their native languages, but they don't use it for governance. They don't use it for education. And when a lot of Africans go abroad, many, sometimes, at least in their next generations, if they live, they don't teach their children the languages. So if languages die, ideas and values die along with it. And so it's going to be a little bit different in terms of the importance for someone like me who was born in the United States. Because when I study the language, I'm trying to get a sense of what it means to be human and what it means to be African prior to the colonial invasions and the enslavement of African people by Arabs and Berbers and Europeans, etc. And so when we are able to go to these languages, we are able to get a grasp of how we collectively saw the world and viewed the world through our lens in terms of speaking our language and what we meant, what we said. And then also for especially those of us in Brazil, in United States, in Canada, in France, who have this desire to want to know more, we look at the languages to see, well, what have we retained in terms of thought, in terms of process, even though the vocabulary has changed. So an example of this is when you go into many African languages, especially West African languages, whatever the word is for eat, to eat or to consume, oftentimes they will use it to mean to defeat someone, right? Now, in the United States, even though we don't have the word, like I remember I used to run track back in high school. And when we would finish our races, you know, we would joke with each other and be like, I ate you up. Or if we're going to play basketball and win, I ate y'all up on the court. Because regardless of the words being used, the semantics is stuck in my head, it's stuck in the culture. And so for us to eat our opponents is to defeat them. And you find the same semantics on the continent of Africa in terms of the native languages. And lastly, for those who are on the continent, it helps to better understand the relationship with other African people. And so oftentimes a group will, and it's nothing malicious, is just, you know, they're concerned with their own people in their own time and space in their own group. And they look at others as different, as significantly different. But a careful analysis and study will show that I have more in common with this group of people who live 2,000 miles from me than I expected. And so I remember reading a text called Conflict of Minds by an author, Jordan Gabani, out of South Africa. And he grew up in apartheid South Africa. And he was a journalist and writer. And he would always write against the colonial and apartheid government. And this caused him to be exiled out of the country. Well, during his exilation, he went into West Africa. And then later on, he went into the United States before returning back to South Africa some years later. But he states in the book that the ideas, the ways, the mannerisms, the values, and things that I thought were just peculiar to us, you know, the Amazulu in South Africa, I find echoes over here in West Africa. Like, you know, I just thought this was just something that we did and we value. So when you look at the classical languages, you're also studying the classical cultures. You're studying the classical people and the way that they express themselves and how they mapped ideas to words and use them to communicate with one another. And when you're able to systematically study that, then you're able to establish relationships between groups. And it becomes very valuable if you have, for example, a lofty goal like the late Dr. Sheikh Diop, to create a United States of Africa. So now if people understand the common relationship with each other and ideas, there's a better basis to unite, to bring all of our resources and manpower together so that we can better fight off neo-colonialism and any kind of future colonialism, because we're organized behind a common history and values.
Right.
So that answers your question.
And yeah, and that's very important, brother Asar, because, you know, for most of us on the continent, we are used to the kind of education that we were told is that we Africans have always been living as tribes, isolated tribes that have no connection with each other. So that's why, in fact, you have the tribalism on the continent is so, this tribalism is so serious to a point that even in our political space, we don't discuss ideology. We don't really discuss our political plan, our party manifesto. It is our tribal affiliation that helps us during the elections. Then we see each other differently based on the tongue that we speak. And sometimes we are told in the schools that we have no connection with each other whatsoever. So that in Liberia, for example, we talk about 16 tribes. Why in reality, when you do linguistics, you find out that there is no 16 tribes. You are actually talking about the same people, you know, using the same, speaking the same language with different tongues. There are different variations of the same tongue. But our intellectuals have overlooked that, and they focus on the European classification of African people and say you are 16 tribes, and each tribe try to give their own folklore and history of how they came about. And these histories are written in books as real history. So to a point that the Hausa has nothing to do with the Igbo, and the Igbo say he has nothing to do with the Yoruba. And the same thing in Liberia, the Mandingo say he has nothing to do with the Mende, and the Mende say he has nothing to do with the Pele. But if we push back enough, 1,000 years or 500 years back, or through the classical linguistics that you are doing, are we now going to say that we drop the idea of tribes in Africa, or we should continue with it? It's important for us to see ourselves as tribes, or the study of classical linguistics should now give a new paradigm in how to define African people?
I believe on the latter. And in my personal opinion, there's going to have to come to a point where African people create a new collective identity. What has to happen is for human beings on the ground to learn how to balance the individual family identities with the larger collective. And if you can do that in a healthy way, I think that, you know, because nobody wants to, let me back up just a little bit, because your languages, your culture and things represent your ancestors. And so at the heart of this is ancestors. And we don't want to abandon and give up ancestors. But if we come to understand that you all share the same ancestors, it's just some of you moved over here and then others of you moved over there. But as you said, if we go back just a few hundred years, all of you share the same ancestors, and your ancestral lineage and blood is existing in these different parts. So we're going to have to better educate our people and to show them the benefits of why it's important to come together, and then of course discuss many of the challenges that will be faced in the transition period, and then in the period for your grandchildren and beyond. And so it's just about having an open and honest conversation, and putting in the work, so that we can move forward.
Thank you very much. So that takes us to our third question here, Brother Asar. What is the state of modern African language in terms of higher studies? As you may be aware, there is no country in Africa or university that uses African languages for higher studies, say degree, a college degree, or master's. Nothing. I think Swahili, they've tried a bit, but I don't know how far that has gone. In West Africa, we have the Ngo script, the Madingo script, which has been used widely now, but still, most of the countries where these languages are being developed is either French or English. So what is the state of modern African languages? Because I will give you an example of what happened in Nigeria. There's a man called Bishop Ajayi Crowther in the 1800s who converted to Christianity, and he was told to make a dictionary of Yoruba language. So for the purpose of those who will read the Bible. So he translated a deity in Yoruba land that we call Eshu, which is actually a traditional deity that has nothing to do with Christianity or Islam. But he translated that as devil in the dictionary. Then he said Eshu means devil. So for 100 years, Nigerian Christians were referring to an African deity as devil. So until recently, when this kind of studies that you are doing and other people are doing, and they come along and say, no, that does not mean devil. It's been mistranslated by you guys, and you use our words, and then you translate them to English wrongly, giving us a European perspective of things, which is not within our language. So now that we are not using our language for higher studies, science is evolving, cultures are evolving. What is the state of our language? Are they becoming more primitive, or they are still useful?
They are still useful. The problem is that for those of us who are conscious of this, there's not enough of us in the positions of power in politics to make the argument in the case for why we need to do such and such. And if more of us were in those positions of power, we can at least do a minor experiment in one place and then show in the future how this is beneficial. And so, it was a big deal in South Africa, in one of the universities in South Africa. A gentleman wrote his PhD dissertation in isiZulu, and it's significant. Like, of course, if for an English speaker in England, that wouldn't be surprising. For a Chinese in China, that wouldn't be such a big deal. For a Japanese in Japan, that's expected. But for an African to write his entire PhD dissertation in his native language, that was a big deal. So, we also have to acknowledge the problems of the many languages in any one given area and the politics that are involved with the languages. And so if, for example, Nigeria chose Yoruba to be the main language that everyone is taught, well, the question is why? Everybody else, why do they get their language to be this, and this? And this causes, conflict. And I know this was the case even more recently in Cameroon with the colonial languages in terms of French and English, in terms of what region would be the dominant language. And so this is why it's important just to, one, have a common language. If it's Kiswahili, let it be Kiswahili. That is the main language that everyone can expect to know, that is taught in the education system, and then of course you can have, you know, other local languages that are taught depending on what area you're in and who dominates in that area. You keep that, but just as English or French are expected to be taught because you are going to be communicating with people across the world in English or French, you should do the same thing with an African language, because Africa is a very large continent, and it has the, you know, the most emerging economies. And so for the future of Africa, it's imperative that the governments decide on one language. And so one of the reasons why Kiswahili is so attractive is because it doesn't have a lot of the baggage that a lot of other languages. So we got to remember that certain local groups have histories with people in the surrounding areas. So, you know, but Kiswahili has always been one of those lingua francas in East Africa due to trade. And so it's not really identified with a particular people. Is now just a floating language in places like Congo and Uganda and Kenya, and, you know, going down into Mozambique. And so this is why it is good to choose a language like this. And you, again, we got to learn to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. So this can be the primary language that everyone on the continent needs to learn and communicate with each other, and write in the government and things. And then you still have your local languages for which you speak and keep your heritage and culture and whatnot. You just use it as a lingua franca like you would do English. So now if everyone learns Kiswahili, you have more people to communicate with, and not just the French-speaking folks in parts of West Africa, or the Portuguese in Mozambique and in Congo, in the southern part of Congo, and then of course English in places like, you know, Nigeria and Ghana, etc. You know, you have a common language, and it helps to solidify your power as African people. So now, not only will you have a language to communicate with each other, you force everyone else around the world to learn your language. Because with Africa being an emerging, you know, center of commerce and the place where all the resources at, they're going to have to learn to speak with you. And so just like how if you want to do business in France, you need to learn French. If you want to do business in the United States, you need to learn English. They over here, we should be learning Kiswahili or whatever
Absolutely.
language the Pan-African language is to do business in Africa. So we don't have to try to learn 20 different languages, you know, in these areas. We have one language we can at least communicate with, we can write and understand, and we can move forward from there. And so it's about power development and being able to communicate with each other so we can do long distance business. And so everything doesn't have to be necessarily sacred and spiritual. It's
Right.
I have some products here and I have some services I want to sell with people in Kenya. You know, how can I communicate with those people in Kenya and or in South Africa? And this is a way in which we do that. And so and just to, on the show topic, if people were to study Kiswahili, you would find common words and ideas already in your language. So this is the whole point. So it's not like you're abandoning anything by learning and using this language, because y'all, it's already related to your language. Y'all share the same ancestors. And so
Yeah,
it just gives you a different perspective on how to use it.
absolutely. I agree with you on that. That's what Diop said. Shekanta Diop said in one of his lectures. He said, if if an Englishman studied in French or studied in Portuguese, he is most closer to his civilization than when he decides to study in Chinese or in a Zulu. So he's far away from Western civilization if he studies in Chinese or in Zulu. The same way, if an African study maybe ancient Kemetic language or he studies Zulu, he is still within the African cultural context. So he has not really gone away. So it's not a question of if I don't speak Hausa, that means my culture is gone. No, your culture is still reflected in all the other cultures around Africa.
Exactly.
So I really agree with you on that. So, Brasa, you specialize in the South Central African languages, doing comparative linguistics with ancient Egyptians. What have you discovered so far? Because, for example, during the Cairo conference in 1974, Dio was able to make a discovery that there is a relationship between the ancient Egyptian language Medu Ndela or Medu Ndela, whatever how people pronounce it differently, and then his mother tongue, which is the Wolof. So he was able to see a lot of concepts there, language, word similarities, and all that. Now that you and others have taken this far, and you have done a lot of research on African languages, what have you discovered in terms of African cultural unity, African philosophy, and African concept of science and all that? Have you made any new discovery how African worldview is different from European worldview, or is all being the same all this while?
In the grand scheme of things, I can't say that I discovered anything new that has not already been fundamentally argued by the likes of Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop and Teofilo Benga and Dr. Abubakar Musalam and others before me, Dr. Mubabingi Balolo. My research has more so solidified and clarified much of their arguments, and to put it in a particular scientific context to reinforce these ideas. And so, we got to remember that when Cheikh Anta Diop first emerged in the 1950s, that's a long, I'm 42 in age, in my age. So that's way before my time, the 1950s. So that was a long time ago. But imagine there's no internet. There's no WhatsApp. Everything that you had to do, you had to physically go to a library and look through the books. There's no PDF files to be able to search. There's no databases that you can enter data in and do a comparative search between the languages. This stuff was hand done in, just flipping the pages and taking meticulous notes. And so there are certain things that you just won't be able to see when you're working like that. But because we stand on the shoulders of giants and we have certain technologies that exist, we can see the larger picture, and we can do those little minor details that they weren't able to do. So I've where they have speculated in certain areas, I've been able to either falsify or reaffirm that this is in fact the case. And so, like, for example, that in Africa, really, and this is kind of hard to explain sometimes to a lot of my English speaking folks here in the United States, because most of us grew up Christian, most of us grew up in Islam, and so they have a conceptualization of God in a particular way, and they believe that the name of God is unique to that particular group of people in that area of time. And so, in that God itself is an entity that exists separate from existence and creation itself. That has not been what I've been able to see across the continent, in of the continent of Africa. God is existence itself, and the names that you find to identify with this entity, if you go into different parts of Africa, the words are going to sound different. But in fact, they are the same. And it's because of Africa's long history that the different dialects and sound mutations in each language have forced the different pronunciations across the continent. So, for example, if you say Amen in the ancient Egyptian, among the Dogon, it is Ama. In Ghana, it is Inyambe. In Congo, it is Nzambe. In other parts of Ghana, it is Inyamene. In Rwanda, it is Imane. And in other parts, it is Ware. In parts of Yoruba land, it's Mbare. In parts of Congo, it is Mbole. In other parts, it is like Ruri. In among the Ga people in Ghana is just Wo. You would think that these are different, but when we do the systematic analysis and we start doing sound changes and we account for the stress in syllables and the dropping of syllables and the weakening of consonants in between vowels, it helps to paint a picture that all the Africans are worshiping the same deity under the same name. And if you are able to show this systematically, in a way, again, it reinforces this African cultural unity, because it's not supposed to be this way. Whether you are speaking a Cushitic language, whether you are speaking so-called Hausa, Yoruba, like I'm working on a book right now, and the title, and I haven't committed it to memory just yet, but it is Chiluba Maweja, Yoruba Orisha, and ancient Egyptian Ak, which should really be like Rechi. An exploratory etymological study is the subtitle. And I was working on a book. I was working on this book here. This is by Dr. Chilemalema Mukinge out of the Congo. So he wrote this text, Muntu wa Nzambi, Portrait of Human as God's Special Creation. So I helped to edit this and design the inside and publish the book for him. And when I was doing the editing and he was naming Maweja as, one of the names of the divine among the Luba people, the Democratic Republic of Congo, he defined all the other words with the other names, but he didn't define Maweja. And so I asked him, what is the meaning of this word? And he didn't know. They just use it for God. But I'm like, that all words for God have a fundamental, just a smaller meaning, just an everyday meaning in the native language. Unless the word was borrowed into the language. Like if you say Yahweh, amongst tree speakers, they don't know what that means, because that's not a tree word or a Yoruba word, so it wouldn't be native to their language for them to understand. So it sparked a research project for me, You know, that's the kind of stuff I love. Oh, we don't know the meaning of that? Let's find out. Let's do the work. And when I did the work, I ultimately came to the conclusion that Maweja is cognate with the Yoruba word Orisha and Orisha in some other dialects. And it is also cognate with, we say Ak or Aku in our Egyptology speak, but the word is more closely to Orisha in the Yoruba language. And that this word for spirit, for God, is all over the continent, you know, as Leza, Kabedza, Kaweja, Weza. In ancient Egyptian, were, you know, it reinforces this notion that we're all using the same words. It's just history. We have such a long history in interactions with each other that these words are pronounced differently. And what happens is, you know, if you are a Yoruba man, right, and you travel and you marry a Ghanaian woman, you know, of Akan ancestry, right? When y'all have children, the children are going to learn Yoruba and they're going to learn Akan. And Akan words will be quote unquote borrowed into the Yoruba. And say you have this collective, you know, for some reason, Yoruba folks just love Akan women and Akan women just love Yoruba men. And over a long time, y'all been intermarrying and mingling and speaking with each other. Y'all borrow each other's words. And now they become native to the language that you use. And so, and over time, you may use it for a particular thing. So for example, in English, we say the word fire for, of course, fire. But we've also borrowed a word pyro in like pyrotechnics. If you ever go to a concert and see the fireworks, you know, we call it pyrotechnics. You get at a concert and they have all the lights and fireworks. They're the same word, but because pyro is borrowed, we use it in a very narrow sense in terms of a particular technology. And this is just how languages work. So if people understand that not only do y'all have a common ancestry, y'all have been interacting with each other for long distances for a very long time. And y'all have been borrowing words and using words in different contexts. And this is how we get this diversity of vocabulary across the continent, which is why the systematic study of linguistics help us to put those puzzle pieces back together and reconstruct those ancestral traditions and to find out, you know, where we've been moving as a people all throughout history and why, you know.
Thank you very much, Asar Imhotep. That's very interesting for this generation. This discovery is really, really important for us. We no longer have to be in the colonial narratives. Our own brothers and sisters are in the field. They are doing the work and bringing out the receipts and making us to see what our languages have been, what they are, and what they need to be in the future. We're going to take a short break right now. And when we come back, we have more questions for Brother Asar Imhotep. Thank you for watching Focus on Liberia. This is Roundtable Africa, and I'm your host. I'm here with Brother Asar Imhotep, our guest, and we are discussing the topic, the classical language of African people. Brother Asar, the one final question here, but the other question underneath is, can Africa create another great civilization without going back to the classical source? Now I'm going to start Diop again. In 1954, I guess, Diop wrote an article in French, said, Quand allons-nous parler de la Renaissance africaine? In that article, he said, African Renaissance is the rediscovery and expression. I don't know how to translate it from French. He said the rediscovery and expression of African creativity and genius. So we need to rediscover. That means we need to go back. We need to really look at our source, our culture, our language, our worldview, our philosophy. Then we need to express it today with our own creativity. That means our own literature. We have to go back to science. We have to go back to art. We have to bring out the African greatness. We don't have to think through the white man. We don't want to wait for the European to validate. If we all have the same intellectual capacity, so nothing stops us from defining our own universe. If they discover a star and then they call it Mercury, we can also call that star another name. We can name the planet anyhow we want. If we don't have to wait for them to do it. But here is the challenge, Brother Asar Imhotep.
All right.
One of the videos where Professor Molefi Kete Asante invited you, you actually explained this concept of going back, what we call, sometimes in the Ghanaian language, they call it Sankofa, going back to get what is important and bring into the future. But you brought in a new word from ancient Egyptian. I think you used the word suruj or something. You will help us with it. How it is important to go back and then collect the best of African culture and bring it into the present. We are not saying we should go back and start tying leaves. We don't say that we should go back and put on cowries on our head. We are not saying that we should go back in the forest and start doing exactly how they were doing agriculture back then. But we are saying, what is the best of our culture that we can bring into modernity in the best way possible to solve modern problems? So how do we do that? And what is the concept of that in African language?
Already. The word that you brought up that I use is what I named, I started this series called Aluja. It's a Chiluba Bantu word. And I'll get into the meaning in just a second. And so what I found is that it is cognate with the ancient Egyptian word rouge. And rouge is a word that means to strengthen, to maintain, to perpetuate, flourish, to be prosperous, success, enduring, permanent, sturdy, steadfast, remain firm, firmness, consistency, be strong, prevail, competence, ability, right? Saruj it has a causative prefix, s, in the language, so it means to make secure, to set right a wrong, to provide, to fulfill a contract, to restore, to repair, to make new again, to make flourish, right? So the cognate in Chiluba is aluja or aluija, as we would say, and it means to restore, to replace what had been removed and deleted. A variant of it is aluka, return or retrace one step. Same thing with aluja. To make, to provide, to retrace one step, to refer to a place of origin. And then another variant, alukija, to think, to reflect, to consider, to render, to make, and other variations with prefixes and suffixes that give you a more nuanced context. But I like aluja and saruj a little bit better than Sankofa, because Sankofa implies that you're just going to get it as is. But Aluja is a careful retracing of one's steps. You're asking the question, well, how did we get here? You refer to your place of origin. And if something is broken, we fix it and return to the present. So you're doing a Sankofa, but it's a more systematic, more precise tracing of the steps to figure out how we got to this present state and to restore that which had been damaged. So that word Saruj is used in a phrase in ancient Egyptian, Saruj Ta, restoring the world. And you would always read in the ancient Egyptian text that a particular pharaoh would build on the legacy of his ancestor. They didn't take pride in just replicating what their ancestors did. They always restored the ruins and made it better. And that's the fundamental concept that Africans have to understand. It's not simply just going back, as you stated already, and just doing things as we have, but to go back and get the best of what we created, improve upon it, and let that be the new foundation for the civilization that we're building currently. So to answer your question, yes, you can build a civilization without going back to the source. But the question is, how strong will it be? How will it last? How will the people thrive in that? How will it be able to withstand opposition, external opposition to it? And these are the kinds of questions that we have. So it's not just about retracing, it's about restoration and improving and making it stronger. And that's what the ancient Egyptians, how they utilize that term. And that's what you would see in the records, that they took pride in their ancestry, but it was the challenge was to improve and do better than what your ancestors. So like, I remember this one text, I forgot the name of it, I cited in a new book, and he talks about, I not only secured our borders, but I went further than my ancestors. I expanded the kingdom more than my ancestors. And so it's about improving and strengthening the community and the society. So now if we go to Fukiao, the late Dr. Kimbwadinde Kiabonseki Fukiao out of the Congo, he would consistently write about leadership in his area and just Africa in general, but how he argues again that you're never going to maintain and be able to build a strong society without going back to those African values and those African ways of governance. And so just because we live in the quote unquote modern era and we see so-called successes in these other countries in the way that they do things, doesn't mean we have to do it the way that they do it. We can build off of our system. So for example, let's say, because we want to make sure that there is gender equality. So let's say, the presidency is like, if we were to build a society, the presidency would be two individuals, a woman and a male who are not married, right? Not a vice president and a president, or whatnot. It's just two. And then that way, for any kind of major decisions for their branch of government, those two have to agree, and they hold equal power and they have equal say. And that's just an idea. It's just, we don't have to do it the way that they do. We could do something different that is based on, you know, our concept of complementarity, you know, between the sexes or whatnot. And so, you know, Foucault's work is a very good or a very good series of texts to read, you know, especially on that subject of African leadership, and his even his PhD dissertation, which you can find out there for free. And if y'all can't find it, I'll give it to you. Y'all could just email me at info@asarimhotep.com and put Foucault dissertation in the subject line, and I'll send it to you. And so his PhD dissertation was on leadership and community and education, and you'll get a sense of, you know, his cares and concerns, of course, with his experience in Congo, and then what we can learn in general by grounding, you know, our political systems on an African template.
Thank you very much, Brasa. You know, this idea of going back and then, you know, not just replicating stuff, but really taking the best of the best and then bringing it into the present to solve modern problems or confront the reality that we are living in. It's really, really important. There is the book I read as well from one African, I've forgotten his name, something Marcelo. He was trying to explain the African concept of democracy, you know, where he used Dahomey. When a West African kingdom, Dahomey, he used an example where you have the elder council, then you have the female, the women council. So the elder council function like what you would call the Senate, and the women assembly was like the representatives or so. So there was a moment where they had to decide on issue of war. So the men council said, no, we are not going for war against the French. And in the night, the women council met. I think the men met at night and the women met during the day. So when the women met, they said, no, we are going for this war. And their resolution reached to the king, and the king said, what the women decided, that would be, it would supersede that of the elder council. And they decided to go to war. So you have this balance where there was this assembly and there was this other assembly, and they all see things differently. Yeah. The men were compromising. Some of them had economic ties with the French. The women were worried about their kids, their economic and their investment, their country, and their dignity. And they said, we have to fight. So you could see the gender balance here going on. There was no colonialists there. There was no white men talking about equality and what have you over the roof. But they were doing things naturally like that. So if you see it replicating even today, even though Africans have changed, but you can see it in the subconscious. When Paul Kagame of Rwanda said his cabinet, I mean, the House of Representatives will be split into two, half men, half women. It was never done anywhere. And people were like, what is this? It's in the subconscious. When you see Liberia, for example, we call ourselves small America, but we elected a female president when America has never tried to do that. Okay. So we should be calling ourselves big America, but we say we are small America, but we've been able to elect a female president for 2 terms, and America has never done that. And all over the continent, you have female in leadership, and nobody is shouting gender this and gender that, but still they are pushing it down our throats when we already have it. So one question here again, the issue, all these beautiful ideas we're trying to bring to create a very bright future for African people. But there is the problem with the African scholarship. There's something called the white man blessing or the white man authority, where our researchers in institutions are always being reduced to Afrocentric, or they've been reduced to some kind of a radical black man. And whenever our women as well, whenever they do research, these research have been put down. Sometimes like Dio, her PhD dissertation was rejected twice. And certain books, if you are not in Harvard, if you are not being approved by the mainstream academia, your work is not seen as authority. The great work you are doing, Brother Asar Imhotep, if you take it to certain university in Africa, they will say that the white men approve it. Even they won't say it directly. They will be saying, who approved it? Who said that this is right? So how do we navigate? How do we really bring about this African Renaissance or Aluja
Mm-hmm.
without the white man blessing, the white man savior thing, that he has to put a stamp on something before it becomes real?
That is a very complex question. It's going to have a very nuanced series of answers, and that is one of the things that Afrocentricity and the academic field of Africology seeks to address. Because at the final analysis, it all boils down to value. And what the reason why you have this, whether it's conscious or unconscious, is that certain African people don't value themselves. They don't value other African people because they don't believe that African people are capable of creating standards, of being rigorous, of being scientific, and of course to be able to come up with viable solutions to problems. So the ultimate issue is value. How do you see your people as valuable? And because when you see your people as valuable, then and you set standards. This is one of the reasons why I appreciate Jean-Claude Mboli's work on the origin of African languages written in French. And because he doesn't just do a standard linguistic analysis. You know, he has an electrical engineering background. So he's in the sciences. I'm in computer science, which is a branch of electrical engineering. And the rigors that we use in computer science and in electrical engineering, he brings that to linguistics. And he makes it harder to make arguments that a lot of Afro-European Africanists were just all willy-nilly with in terms of their so-called comparisons. And as a person of science, when I looked at his work, I immediately knew that this was stronger than what the European was saying. And because I value African people, I was able to immediately recognize that and recognize any shortcomings if there's some in some areas. But the especially when it comes to language, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to trust the people who speak it. No one's going to know more about the language than the native speaker. Remember that the European has to come and speak to y'all to write about the language. And so when you have African linguists who know their language and knows how to systematically study languages, to me, they're going to have higher priority than just some European who came and studied, a few months or whatnot, because they don't know how the little nuances about the language and how it's used and stuff like that. So it's about understanding our value and making other Africans valuable. So if we say that Cheikh Anta Diop is the standard, Cheikh Anta Diop is the standard, just the way that they would think of Einstein as the standard. Now, he's made mistakes, and certain of his ideas, collapse in a certain area of physics, but they still praise that man as setting the foundation for all the modern science in terms of physics and even quantum mechanics to an extent. And this is how we have to do. We have to call the names of those ancestors who have laid that foundation. This is how you make them valuable. This is how you make them live. And so that's part of the problem. And then secondly is we have to do what powerful people do. So going back to one of your first questions, in terms of the languages in our universities. If the language of education is French and English and Portuguese in some other areas, obviously all the knowledge and information can only come from groups that originated the English, French, and Portuguese languages. But if you start writing in African languages and you start doing scientific treaties and formulas and writing and stuff in African languages, now you're seeing yourself in that pool at the table, or you at the seat at the table, you know, as a holder of power, and not simply waiting on others to come and validate you. You know, you have to set up your own validating body. And you set the standard. And that's all it is. It's an issue of power.
Right. This is really something we look forward to this generation to really try to cross that, because they have destroyed a lot of our scholars through this name calling and all that. When you type on Wikipedia, they begin to call this one Afrocentric and Afrocentric. And when they use the word Afrocentric in a very condescending way, it means somebody who is pseudo, it means somebody to them. Okay, but the idea that Molefi Kente said to put the African idea at the center of everything that we study, they don't see that. Or something like you said, many African things that's not even important. Why should African idea be the center of anything? Let us wait for these people to like many a time when I cite some of these African scholars, they are like, oh no, who knows them? They are not being approved. I say, approved by who?
Exactly.
Is there a standard that we can say 1 + 1 is equal to 2? Then why is it then do I have to wait for someone to tell me it's actually 2? So then there is something wrong.
I want to add as well is that part of the issue is African people being competent enough in the field to validate other Africans. And so if you don't have a background in the field, you know, you're kind of forced to look at others. But if you can see that's the difference. When I saw Mboli's work, I had the background, and in not only in just the science, but in linguistics itself. And so when I read it, I immediately knew the value of the work. I didn't have to get other Black people's, you know, approval or Europeans. I'm confident in my own skills and my own knowledge that I can judge a quality work for what it is, regardless to who it is. And so the ultimate thing is that more of us have to get qualified in the fields to be able to understand when, you know, somebody is making a significant contribution or whatnot, or when something is just totally pseudo, you know, in the field, and so that you can defend it in the public. And so if I just know how to do math and somebody puts some equations, I don't have to wait for a while. I can just do it. I can just look at it and see and go and do the work myself and say, oh, this is it. You know. But there's a level of competence that we have to have in ourselves in these different fields to be able to do the validation and not be so and not wait on others. And it reminds me of, I remember some years ago, a woman out of the Congo who was in France working on her PhD. Her professors wouldn't let her cite Cheikh Anta Diop or Theophile Obenga. And when she asked, did you read the text? He hadn't read the text. You know, he was just going off of what some other people had said about these African scholars. And now he used that, and this was a European man who made a judgment call and said that you can't cite Cheikh Anta Diop and Theophile Obenga. And it's like, how? When they're more qualified in this than you. And I remember, for example, Dr. Muba Benge Bilolo, and it should be floating somewhere. And I'll try to make this as brief as possible. There was a national Egyptology conference that Bilolo had sent an abstract for to present at this conference. And so he asked the question, is ancient Egyptian a Bantu language? And his abstract was rejected. But what he noticed is that when it came time for the conference, is that all of the people who were accepted were kind of just the status quo, white male from Europe, from Germany, France, and the United States. There was no women. There was no people from Africa, but this was an international conference of Egyptology. And then when he looked at the credentials of all of the people, he's like, which one of y'all has more education than me? My degrees and my studying over this period of time includes anthropology, includes philosophy, includes linguistics, includes Egyptology. And even to the point where he studied, government and stuff like this. He's like, which one of you are from a royal line and have seen an actual African royal funeral? Because he is an actual prince in from his province. He's talking about, which one of y'all speaks 12 African languages? Who of y'all is more qualified than an Obenga and a Sheikh Anta Diop in terms of education? Because remember, all of these folks have the quote unquote best education at these top tier schools. So he's like, which one of them is qualified to reject my paper? And so what he was bringing out is the fact that, when certain white people are invalidating works, they're not invalidating at all. They're just dismissing without carefully examining the arguments of the African scholars. And so what African people will do is look at their rejection and then think that it has merit because they value their word over African people. But it's funny that when Sheikh Anta Diop and Teofilo Benga were arguing that you cannot demonstrate a relationship, for example, between the Semitic languages and ancient Egyptian, they were dismissed. They didn't know what they're talking about. They're just black radical Afrocentrists, as you said earlier. But lo and behold, there was a recent conference full of white linguists and scholars of Semitic and Egyptian saying that we cannot demonstrate a relationship using the comparative method between ancient Egyptian and Semitic languages. They had a whole conference about this. And they're coming out with a book on the subject. And so one has to wonder, was Sheikh Anta Diop crazy? Was Teofilo Benga just some Rudy Poot, linguist when he made these accusations? Why some decades later are you saying the exact same thing after y'all actually start doing the real work and test to try to prove that Semitic and Egyptian are closely related? And this is what I mean. Sometimes the validation doesn't come immediate, but they're now, when we talk about multidisciplinariness in scholarship, Sheikh Anta Diop's the first to do that. Teofilo Benga, that's why they had to study anthropology, archaeology, linguistics, philosophy, all of this stuff to come to the Cairo Symposium in 1974 and make their arguments. Everybody else was looking weak because they didn't have that multidisciplinary training. Now, multidisciplinary is the buzzword, to be able to attack any kind of academic, question. This is stuff that the Africans were already doing. And so it's these kinds of conversations have to be had and this kind of information has to be shared so that we understand how to value African people, and to understand that we just aren't some Rudy Poots out here just saying anything all willy-nilly, that our arguments are sound and it's based on systematic research and rigor and critical thinking. And that's just what African people do.
Thank you very much, Brother Asar Imhotep. I certainly agree with you. It's time for African people to step up. This issue of self-confidence and relying on ourselves, believing in our own intellectual capacity and capability is very, very important. And when we should do self-critique as well, we should have people that should be able to critique our own work and see if it conforms with scientific, and not just based on people's bias and other people, because we should always have suspicion. A Chinese will not allow a German to come and become an expert on Chinese history and culture, and then Chinese people begin to teach his book. It will never happen, okay? The German will not allow an Indian to say, I'm an expert on German history and culture, and I can speak German. So that's what Theophilo Benga said. These guys are imposters. They come to Africa, they can't speak a single language, they didn't learn it, and they said they are Africanists. They are experts of Africa. And our universities are saying that, yes, these are the people to tell us who we are. It's terrible. We shouldn't allow this to happen. And the Dr. Ben and other people have been going to Egypt, they put in the work, and people are still kind of looking at their work as if you can critique the work, if you can find flaws in it and you can present it. We are still critiquing Darwin, but where there are facts, let us say this is fact. We should not dismiss them under one name called Afrocentrism, which is very, very dangerous. And I think even within our community, we are doing it. We have Black people saying this person is not credible because he's Afrocentric. That's not an objective way of critiquing. Try to bring out the method. What method did he use? Is it scientific or is not scientific? That's where the argument should be based. So I think it's time for us to step up and really challenge, because the future generation need this. We can't always be waiting for people to define who we are, define our languages. Then that's why we are killing each other in Africa, because we keep reading European books telling us that the Hausa is not Igbo. The Igbo has nothing to do with Hausa. So when an Igbo man sees an Hausa man, he wants to tear it into pieces. He said, I don't know this guy. And when the Yoruba sees an Igbo man, he said, we have nothing in common. They are Jews. The Yoruba Igbo said they are Jews. And then the Yoruba, that's more than decided that Yoruba said they came from heaven. They fell down from the sky through Oduduwa. And the Hausa said their ancestors came from Baghdad. You know, ridiculous. There is no archaeological evidence, linguistic, nothing of the kind. And these are taught in schools, okay? I went to school in Nigeria where we learned the Hausa people came from Baghdad, and then their ancestor came through a big snake, and all these kind of ridiculous stories, okay? So it's time to put in the work. Asar, thank you very much for coming to Focus on Liberia. We really appreciate what you're giving us today, a lot of knowledge. I would like you to give your closing remark. You know, recently, I think it was in 2020, last year, a French researcher released a film called K2020, The Great Pyramid. It's a documentary about ancient Egypt, how the pyramids were built, how the ancient Kemites were able to set the foundation of modern science and all that. But during his research, trying to put the documentary together, he came across Diop work, and he came across Dr. Ben and other Africans. So when he studied that, he changed the entire documentary and decided to show Black people in the documentary as the actual Kemite. And the film it's on YouTube. It's called K2020, The Great Pyramid. And he explained it. And this movie, when the documentary was in still preparation, the French audience were anticipating, they were happy, they wanted to watch it because he brought up a new theory how the pyramid were built. But when the documentary came out in the film theater and they saw melanated Black Egyptians on the screen, they were like, damn it, we have to boycott it. And they started saying that every theory the guy presented is wrong. So he said, why? He said, because you quoted Herodotus, and Herodotus is not credible. He said, look, this is what I presented. If you want to critique, let's go into it. But they boycotted the entire film in France. And then he ended up putting it on YouTube for people to just watch it. And then the documentary is there. He did it in French and English. And you can see the resentment, you can see the invisible war against our culture and our identity and our humanity. And some people think it's a joke. So I thank you very much for putting in the work on classical African language and African culture, and why it is necessary for us to do Aluja or Suruj or go back and bring the best of our culture and be able to solve modern problems with science and technique. So your closing remarks to our people.
All I have to say is thank you again. I thoroughly enjoyed my time here, and these are the kinds of discussions I like to have, and I just encourage, African people to study African works written by African people, and to learn the methods of the field so that you can validate it. And if you're one of the few who decide to enter in the field and make contributions, strengthen the field. Where there's flaws in the methodology, plug it up and make it stronger, and build that foundation of African sciences. And that was the dream of Cheikh Anta Diop. And I hope that I am continuing in his legacy. And I see the vision. And this is what I, strive to work towards. And so it just takes, us to be bold and to declare ourselves in the world unapologetically, and to recognize the commonality, not dismissing any differences, but to recognize the commonalities that we have with each other, and to use those commonalities to build a brighter future for Africa and its diaspora. And so with that, I say thank you for having me. Thank your audience for listening. And again, if you want Dr. Fukiao's PhD dissertation, you can hit me up at info@asarimhotep.com and just put Fukiao dissertation in the subject line, and I'll reply back with the document. So thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Brother Asar. We would like to have you again in the nearest future to discuss a lot of topics. We learned a lot here today, and the necessity of learning our languages and then trying to our best to challenge modern science and also be on the table. Like you said, let us be on the table of civilization and not us just eating crumbs from the table. We have to have a seat on the table as co-equals with the rest of the civilization. We thank you very much, and we appreciate it. We say ashe to you, and we say dua. Then we play our party music here. It's called We Are All Liberians.
We are Liberians. Liberia is our home. Liberian people. USA all we want. Liberia, oh. USA all we want. Liberia, me Liberia. Our father.
Our